Okay, from this afternoon, or that's my time, I don't know when you're watching this, but the previous screencast we dealt with some nutrient cycles, and we've talked about generally this idea of an abiotic source for some nutrient, and that source giving the living things this nutrient they need, but those living things eventually giving back that nutrient to that abiotic source again. Hence a cycle. The water cycle is a cycle you've learned since you were very tiny little people, I'm quite certain, and is nothing new to you and barely worth our time to discuss, except for I do want to make sure you understand a really important part of how living things interact with water as well. Now, you know from learning this over and over again since you were little ones that we have many, many sources, abiotic sources, reservoirs of water available on the planet. Oceans, lakes, things like that. Excuse me. And groundwater, all kinds of sources. Normally we think of these water sources evaporating into the air. And so we have water vapor in the air, which comes back to us as precipitation, which then goes back into runoff and so on. So that's typically the part of the water cycle that we get. The part that I am interested in you focusing on is this part, on transpiration. This is another way that water leaves these sources we see on the ground and goes into the air, but it does so through the body of a plant. Okay? In this case, surface water is our abiotic reservoir. Generally speaking, it gets into plants by raining down on them, percolating into the soil, and so the plants take it up in their roots, and it goes back into the abiotic reservoir through evaporation, runoff, which you hear about all the time, but this idea of transpiration is what we really need to focus on now. Transpiration, an extraordinarily important way that water moves from the ground into the air, and one that is very commonly overlooked. The blue arrows are what we want to focus on here as water is taken from the soil into the roots of a plant. It moves up into the tissues of the plant where it is used for a variety of purposes, hits the leaves, and then it doesn't just stay there. It exits some of it, not all of it, some of it is used, but some of it exits through holes in the leaf surface called stomata, which you may remember learning in the past. That is not trivial. When you have vast acreage of plant life taking water out of the soil and lifting it up into the air like that, it can make a very large impact on weather patterns. When you have plant roots that are taking water out of the soil and using it, it can have a really big impact on runoff patterns and whether or not the soil is stable and the nutrients in that soil are stable, or whether those nutrients are just going to run away because there's nothing there to hold the water in place. So this idea of transpiration, okay, water moving from the roots up to the shoots of the plant, bottom to top, leaving through these tiny holes that we call stomata in the leaf structure, and we'll talk much more about those later on. But you ought to be aware of transpiration and that it is not a trivial matter, okay? Let's look at an example of this. If you have a forested area and you mow down the trees, okay, that means that groundwater that falls on the ground and goes into the soil is not necessarily going to get transpired up into the atmosphere, and so a source for water vapor will not be present, which means precipitation that you are used to getting in an area, because water vapor is going into the air and then gets consolidated and comes back down as rain, doesn't happen. That can lead to something called desertification, where vast areas become water poor and become like desert. Okay. Additionally, when you don't have, just as what we've just talked about, when you don't have the vegetation there to catch and hold that soil and hold that moisture that's in the soil in the area, then their runoff is just much greater. And again, both of these things can lead something from really changing into a completely different type of biome than what was there before. Okay? Desertification is the term for that. All right, there's been studies done. As you can see here, this Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest is a forest where they just basically cut out this large swath that you can see there to study what the effects are when you just deforest an area. What happens to the soil? What happens to the region there? What's been found, as they've taken measurements and so on, this graph. I've seen a graph almost exactly like this show up on an AP test. You need to be able to look at something like this and see what it is showing. Okay? My advice to you on AP exams, and that's what your tests are going to be like coming up this year. They are all going to be old AP questions. Many of these questions deal with showing you data and often a graphical representation of data and making sure that you can understand what you're being shown. Additionally, you are often asked to make graphs based on data you are given. So you need to be able to pick this apart. What this is showing, we've got your x-axis along the bottom showing time. Your y-axis goes across up the side, which is essentially showing what is measured during when this experiment was done. Essentially what they measured over time was the amount of nitrate, okay, in the runoff, which is the water running off the surface of the land, in an area that was deforested, which is indicated by the red line, and an area that was left forested, which is indicated by the blue line. And what you can obviously see is that in the deforested area, you've got an incredible leap in the amount of nitrate that is in the runoff. Why? Because there's no roots there to keep the soil in place, and so the nutrients in the soil simply leach out and are run off with the rainwater as it runs down the hill. You also see some trends from year to year as the lines go up and down. You need to be able to think about what could be causing that, what could be causing those seasonal fluctuations, and maybe we'll talk about that when we examine this graph a little more closely. So that's the bottom line on this graph. What you want to take from this slide, though, is how can I look at this? How can I figure out what's going on? What is this information telling me? Okay. We'll talk about why nitrogen is important. Actually, we've talked about that a little bit. Phosphorus. We'll talk about these nutrients later on. Okay. This is where we start jumping into our discussion of energy in an ecosystem, and I will stop here, and hopefully maybe we'll be able to put the bulk of this into just one little video coming up. All right, thanks a lot, and we'll see you in the next little screencast. Good night.